just want to start by extending my thanks to Anne, Ilia, and the Jordan Center for organizing this and hosting this forum. And I know this has been said many times already, but it's really such a wonderful initiative which allows someone like me to take part in these really interesting intellectual exchanges from 12 time zones away at a time when sort of international travel is really not an option. So thank you so much. And then of course I want to thank Sarah and Margaret for organizing the seminar series, and many thanks to Nathaniel for serving as a discussant today. And finally, thank you to everybody for joining at the start of a new academic year in what I know are really challenging circumstances for many of us. So thank you, and an hour earlier than usual. So I really appreciate that. Thank you. My talk today is coming out of my second book project on Russian Orientalism and the aesthetics of empire, in which I examine how Russian artists grappled with the dramatic expansion of Russia's borders in the course of the 19th century and their exposure to a number of diverse cultures, representationals, traditions, and spaces, both real and imagined. And the chapter from which today's material is drawn more specifically examines the experiences of Russian artists in Paris and how their encounters with European conventions and codes of representing racial and ethnic others were then translated or mistranslated into the Russian context. So that's just to give you a little context of where this material is coming from. And I am going to now share my slides with everybody. I'm hoping everyone can see them. Okay, great. So Vasilii Polenov and Ilia Repin's 3-year sojourn in Paris from 1873 to 1876 as pensioners of the Imperial Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg has long been the subject of considerable interest among Russian and Western scholars alike. To date, most investigations into this topic have centered on the artist's formative encounters with the French avant-garde, and especially Edouard Manet and the Impressionists, as Repin called them. Both artists had gleaned important stylistic and thematic lessons from the French modernists, as reflected in their Parisian works, such as a portrait of Vera Repina that you see here, but also the outskirts of Paris, Montmartre, Forest Pathway, Normandy Beach, and most famously a Parisian cafe, which Repin exhibited at the Paris Salon of 1875. However, less attention has been paid to their sustained engagement with European Salon painting, and especially the Orientalist genre, and the ways in which it had made a lasting impact on both their artistic praxis, conceptually and materially. Accordingly, in today's presentation, I will examine a number of paintings that Polenov and Repin had produced in Paris, which depict ethnically and racially diverse subjects, and which have not received much scholarly attention up until now. Through a combination of close formal readings and broader analyses of the specific contexts in which these paintings were produced, I will probe a number of complex and interconnected issues, such as Russian exceptionalism and imperialist discourse, as well as nationalist versus cosmopolitan aesthetic sensibilities. Were Polenov's and Repin's representations of racial and ethnic others on a continuum with 19th century European conventions, or did they break with them in illuminating ways? Were the artists fully cognizant of the fraught interracial interface of this period when they chose to depict typically marginalized subjects, or were they simply adopting fashionable art world trends? Finally, did the artist's own peripheral position vis-a-vis Western Europe reflect a different artistic subjectivity and a less stable self-other relationship with their subjects? In addition to the artworks themselves, I will also very briefly touch upon their critical reception by period viewers in Russia and the ways in which these paintings might be reflective of evolving Russian ideas on race, nationality, and empire in the late 19th century. Already during their student years in the 1860s at the Imperial Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg, Repin and Polenov came to admire a number of prominent European Orientalists and Salon painters, such as Mariana Fortuny, Henri Regnault, Jean-Léon Gérôme, Léon Bonnat, and Lawrence Alma-Tadema. During their subsequent stay in Paris, they were able to see many of these works in person. For example, here's Fortuny. After visiting Fortuny's studio in Rome in 1873, Repin wrote to Ivan Kromskoy that the Spanish paintings were rarities, diamonds, and that all other European art paled in comparison while, and I quote, with gigantic steps Fortuny stalks the horizon. Long live Fortuny, 3 exclamation marks. Similarly, Repin and Polenov expressed a profound admiration for the French Orientalist Henri Regnault, whom Repin described as, quote, an unparalleled genius. In Paris, the Russian artist made sure to see all of Regnault's major paintings, including the latter's Salome and the execution without trial under the Moorish kings. They even went through the trouble of acquiring Regnault's collection of published letters about his travels in Spain and North Africa, which Repin claimed that they read every night with great enthusiasm, even though certainly in Repin's case, he wasn't particularly fluent in French. In addition to the museums, galleries, and exhibitions in Paris, Repin and Polenov also gained exposure to the English art scene after a brief trip to London in May of 1875 in the company of 2 American and 2 Polish artists, Frederick Bridgman, Charles Sprague Pierce, Pantaleon Zindler, and Władysław Zerner. All 4 of these artists were proficient in the Orientalist genre and had produced paintings on exotic themes and subjects. And here are some examples of them. Bridgman was a student of the celebrated French Orientalist Jean-Léon Gérôme and had made several trips to North Africa between 1872 and 1874, producing approximately 300 sketches, which became the source material for various later oil paintings, which earned him the epithet of the American Gérôme. Pierce had likewise studied under the prominent French Orientalist Léon Bonnat and had produced multiple Eastern-themed paintings such as Morzouk and the Arab Jeweler. Finally, Zindler and Zerner had also created a number of artworks on the subject of the Orient, a topic that must have surely been at the center of numerous conversations and debates during the London trip. In just 1 week, Repin and Polenov managed to visit an extraordinary number of historical sites, architectural monuments, museums, and music halls. Some of the highlights of the trip included the Houses of Parliament, Westminster Abbey, Royal Albert Hall, St. Paul's Cathedral, the National Gallery, British Museum, South Kensington Museum, Crystal Palace, Royal Academy of Art, and the Tower of London. So quite a busy week they had in May. Polenov and Repin were deeply impressed by the centuries-old antiquities in the British Museum, which at the time of their visit contained thousands of artifacts from across the world, spanning millennia, and included imposing stone sculptures from the ancient Assyrian city of Nimrud and the bust of King Ramses II, which might have inspired Polenov's Egyptian Girl. In their respective correspondence, both artists also mentioned the various architectural courts of the Crystal Palace, and in particular, the Egyptian, Pompeian, and Alhambran courts, which they found to be extremely well executed, and in the words of Polenov, and I'm quoting him, intelligently, rigorously, and seriously designed, end of quotation. One of the key objectives of the London trip was to attend the annual exhibition at the Royal Academy of Arts, where Edwin Long's The Babylon Marriage Market had attracted large crowds and garnered widespread praise, selling at auction for the highest price ever achieved by any painting in England during the entire 19th century. Based on a description of Babylonian customs in Herodotus's histories, the action of the painting is set in ancient Mesopotamia and depicts the auctioning off of eligible females of marrying age to the highest male bidder. Representing different racial and ethnic types, the women are portrayed seated in the immediate foreground of the painting, patiently awaiting their turn on the podium. Long modeled both the male and female figures after Assyrian reliefs, consciously historicizing the setting and basing the headwear, patterned garments, wall and floor decorations on ancient Near Eastern sources. In a letter to leading Russian cultural critic Vladimir Stasov, Repin described Long's painting as, quote, highly original in composition and an expressively rendered wonderful picture, end of quotation. And Repin claimed that it was one of his favorite artworks of the entire trip, alongside the Rembrandts in the National Gallery and the Parthenon frieze in the British Museum, so really high up there. In addition to Long's painting, the Royal Academy of Arts exhibition also included a number of Frederick Leighton's Orientalist pictures from his trips to Egypt and Syria, such as Little Fatima, Eastern Slinger, and the interior of the Grand Mosque at Damascus, as well as Henry Wallace's Fugitives from Constantinople and Arthur Ditchfield's On the Nile near Cairo. Repin's and Polenov's experiences in London clearly made a lasting impression on both artists, who proceeded to create a series of works on exotic subjects shortly after their return to Paris, including the Odalisque, which you just saw earlier, Egyptian Girl, The Lookout, Woman with a Dagger, A Jew of Prayer, and of course the portrait of a Negro woman. These paintings were not only atypical of the visual repertoire of the Передвижники, but also radically departed from Repin's and Polenov's other Parisian works on modern urban themes. It is important to note here that upon his return from London, Repin completely repainted his Slavic-themed magnum opus Sadko in the Underwater Kingdom, which he had begun in the autumn of 1873. In January of 1876, Repin wrote to Stasov that the latter, quote, would hardly recognize my painting of Sadko as it has changed to such a great extent. It is now an entirely different painting, end of quotation. Commissioned by the future Tsar Alexander III and based on the subject of a medieval Novgorod Bylina or epic poem, the painting shows the merchant Sadko in the underwater realm of the Sea King in the process of choosing a bride for himself among the various beautiful sea maidens. In the end, Sadko chooses the homely Russian girl Chernava to be his bride. In an early letter to Pyotr Isiev from 1873, Repin described the parade of women vying for Sadko's attention as being predominantly European. So he mentions Greek, Italian, Spanish, Dutch, and French maidens, and explains that they would subtly represent, quote, the ideals of his most beloved genius artists, such as Veronese, Titian, Murillo, Rembrandt, and Rubens, while he himself viewed himself as an artistic Sadko, dazzled by all the incredible artworks that Europe had to offer. So that was his plan in 1873. However, upon his return from London in the summer of 1875, Repin heavily reworked the canvas, adopting markedly non-European ethnicities for his sea princesses. Around this time, he wrote a letter to Stasov in which he mentioned his good luck in finding a wonderful model for the Persian princess. So this is, an earlier sketch from 1873 where we see this woman in a Spanish costume. So he mentions to Stasov that he found a model for the Persian princess. And he must have been referring to the woman he depicted in a series of preparatory sketches, such as this one, including the one titled Woman with a Dagger on the left here, which Repin then proceeded to incorporate into a design on a ceramic plate under the title Persian Princess. The same model appears to have been used for another study titled Head of an Indian Princess. In the final painting, she is portrayed in the immediate foreground over here, casting a fiery glance at Sadko. Behind her, we see a number of other racially and ethnically diverse female times, decked out in bright and exotic garments, embellished headdresses, and resplendent jewelry. The underwater maidens in Sadko thus recall Long's Babylonian marriage market, as well as the ubiquitous harem scenes which Repin would have seen in the Paris Salon. The striking nudity in the immediate foreground of Repin's painting, which was highly uncharacteristic for him, but which at that point in time was virtually a cliche of the Orientalist genre, also reveals the artist's willingness to adopt a so-called French accent in his art, as one period Russian reviewer phrased it. Finally, according to one of Repin's letters, the setting for the unfolding action was meant to evoke the exotic and was to be based on, quote, Moorish and Indian architecture. The intricate stone carvings and ornate towers visible in the left-hand side of the painting do indeed recall Hindu and Khmer rock-cut architecture, examples of which Repin would have been able to see at the Crystal Palace in London. Although Repin himself considered his Sadko painting to be a resounding failure that ultimately did not cohere into a holistic and persuasive image, many of his contemporaries, such as the critic Apollon Matushinsky and the scholar and archaeologist Adrian Prachov, describe it as an astounding and unprecedented work in its originality and maintained that it demonstrated Repin's dexterity with both foreign and national artistic paradigms. Repin was awarded the title of academician for Sadko, and the painting was almost immediately acquired by Tsarevich Alexander Alexandrovich for his royal collection of Russian painting. A closer look at the racial dynamics in Sadko reveals certain noteworthy departures from French and English paintings on similar themes, such as Long's Babylonian marriage market and Gérôme's slave market from 1871. All three paintings are structured around the same theme of male protagonists, either portrayed or presumed, choosing a bride or concubine from a selection of racially diverse and sexually available women. In both Long's and Jerome's images, there is a presumed racial hierarchy, with the light-skinned women being the most valuable and sought after, and the dark-skinned ones implicitly being marked as less desirable. Indeed, as art historian Adrian Childs argues, the racial diversity in such works was specifically meant to offset the dramatic racial binaries at play in the contrasts between the white woman's beauty and the implied ugliness of her Black counterpart. When Jerome's Slave for Sale on the right was first exhibited in London's Royal Academy in 1873, the critic E.B. Shulman contrasted the moving pathos of the beautiful light-skinned Eve over here, who was tragically doomed to dishonor as a concubine in an Oriental harem, with the, quote, jet-black Abyssinian semi-nude, who sits careless of her fate, whilst a marvelous monkey squats by her side. From the terms of sale, almost an acknowledged equal, the monkey and negress evidently going together as one lot, end of quotation. While the white woman is humanized and intended to elicit empathy and pity from the viewer, the Black woman is marked as degenerate and accepting of her fate, implying that slavery is a condition commensurate with the Black body. Conversely, Repin does not seem to deploy such implicit or explicit binaries. The figure of a dark-skinned woman in a feathered headdress in the middle foreground is majestic and elaborately dressed. She holds her head high and casts an almost disdainful glance at Sadko from above. Although in the folktale, Sadko ultimately chooses the Russian girl as opposed to one of the exotic maidens, the former is not pictorially embellished or visually prioritized in any way in Repin's painting. On the contrary, she's rendered in the distant background, cast in shadows, and virtually imperceptible to the viewer. Such distinctive and atypical artistic choices on the part of Repin raise a series of provocative questions. Was the artist aware of the fraught racial interface inherent in the representation of marginalized and racialized subjects? Did he intentionally transgress European pictorial racial codes, or was he simply an outsider who was not sufficiently attuned to their nuances? Arguably, the direct colonial power relations that structured British and French portrayals of Black people were not as immediate in Repin's and Polenov's case, for whom the concept of empire was not necessarily equated with Blackness. In fact, if we turn our attention now to Polenov's and Repin's standalone depictions of Black women, or I should rather say Black women in the singular, as they seem to have shared the same model, their departure from established European conventions is even more manifest than in the case of Repin's Sadko in the Underwater Kingdom. As Childs explains, there are virtually no individual portraits of Black women in European art of the long 19th century, and the very few exceptions that exist, such as Marie Guillemine Benoit's portrait of a Black woman from 1800, or Frederick Bazille's Black woman with peonies from later in the century, from 1870, these exceptions only really prove the general rule. Artists who travel to the Middle East and North Africa often produced close-up oil, pencil, and watercolor studies of Black figures, which reflect the quote-unquote scientific interest in Black physiognomy and ethnography, but resist the traditional categorization of portraiture. In fully developed, finished paintings that depict Black women, they're almost always relegated to the secondary roles of servants and slaves, deprived of their individuality and reduced to the status of inanimate props, as implied by period commentators, often comparing them to ebony and jet, decorative luxury commodities or accents that punctuate the primary white subjects. The same could be said of the few 19th century representations of Black subjects who are almost exclusively featured as servants to aristocratic sitters in line with the prevalent European fashion of the time, such as Karl Bryullow's portrait of the Countess Samoilova and Oleg Kipriansky's Countesses Maria Potocka and Sofia Shuvalova. And I apologize for the poor quality of the slide on the right. Accordingly, Repin's portrait of a Negro woman and Polenov's Egyptian girl were outliers, both in the European and the Russian pictorial canons. Sorry, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. One explanation for their unusual choice of subject matter is the sheer accessibility of non-European models in Paris, which was not the case back in Russia. Black people from Africa and the Caribbean, although marginalized, were increasingly part of an international population in the City of Lights. In addition to being laborers and domestic servants, people of color were also active in the entertainment world as musicians, dancers, circus performers, and artist models. Repin's and Polenov's shared studio was on the Rue Vernon, an area which included one of Paris's most concentrated Black populations. In fact, it was just an 8-minute walk from the Rue de Vintimille, where Edouard Manet's renowned Black model Laure lived, who you see on the right here. Consequently, as exotic visualization of the modern French urban spectacle culture, Black bodies did not only furnish Repin and Polenov with the opportunity to try their hands at novel and unusual subject matter, but also provided them with a rare chance to assert their cosmopolitanism and modernity. By the same token, given their own peripheral position in the Parisian art world as foreigners and outsiders who moved almost exclusively in Russian émigré circles and who sometimes struggled financially and professionally, Repin and Polenov were potentially less beholden to the established formats and rigid self-other binary governing such depictions. Thus, for example, although the Black female model in Repin's portrait of a Negro woman is accessorized and inflected with Orientalist accoutrements and props, such as the hookah pipe, discarded Persian slippers, ornate coffee pot, brocaded silk fabrics, and elaborate glistening necklace and pearl earrings, the sitter nonetheless comes across as a self-confident and dignified individual who commands the viewer's sustained attention. She does not register as merely an odalisque or an oriental type, despite Repin's obvious sensuous delight in rendering the different glimmering surfaces and sumptuous textures. David Jackson describes this portrait in the following way, and I quote, "Behind the showy facade is an accomplished and sympathetic portrait. The high shimmering brow, large dark eyes, and resolute set of the mouth all lend a solemn dignity to the sitter, and the hands, elongated and delicately painted, fall into the woman's lap in a graceful and artfully conceived pose." End of quotation. Similarly, in his monograph on Repin, Igor Grabar noted that the portrait is rendered with, quote, "tremendous human warmth," while the artist and critic Alexander Savinov emphasized the model's psychological presence, writing, quote, that the Negro woman is a person who palpably possesses an emotional and intellectual life, end of quotation. Akin to Repin's portrait, Polenov's Egyptian girl is equally unprecedented in Russian art. It is possible that it might have been a study for a larger artwork on an ancient Egyptian theme, such as the prodigal son, on which Polenov worked intermittently between 1874 and 1876, but which he ultimately left unfinished. However, given the Egyptian girl's relative imposing size, measuring 88.5 by 118 centimeters, and in light of its high degree of finish, it is more likely to have been a standalone work that could have been inspired by a confluence of different experiences and diverse sources, such as Polenov's visit to the Egyptian court in the Crystal Palace in London, his exposure to the extensive Egyptian collection in the Louvre, the 1871 premiere of Giuseppe Verdi's opera Aida, and of course a series of contemporary paintings on the subject of ancient Egypt and the biblical Orient, such as Edward Joan Poynter's Israel in Egypt and Feeding the Sacred Ibis in the Halls of Karnak, and Lawrence Alma-Tadema's Egyptian chess players and Joseph, overseer of Pharaoh's granaries. In fact, there are several striking pictorial parallels between Polenov's and Alma-Tadema's paintings. The grainy, textured impasto surface of the wall as well as the blue and red floral motifs, the large cut-off ceramic vessel and accompanying white wooden stand on the extreme left-hand side of Alma Tadema's picture, all seem to have been directly replicated by Polenov. Unlike Repin's strong, self-assured woman, Polenov's Egyptian girl seems to be much more vulnerable and withdrawn. Her facial expression is pensive and almost melancholic. Her posture is guarded and closed off, and her gaze is demurely averted from the viewer. Although the model is shown topless and we're given a clear view of her exposed right breast, her shielded posture thwarts a sense of immediate and enticing sexual availability. As in Repin's portrait, Polenov's painting is visually opulent and sensuous, combining a rich array of bright, saturated colors and glittering surfaces with striking juxtapositions of alternating smooth and rough textures. Overall, however, there is something foreboding and ominous about this image. It is not clear who this woman is supposed to be and what her role is in the setting. Is she a priestess, a concubine, or a Nubian slave? On the one hand, she wears a luxurious headdress and an ornate jewelry. On the other, she sits on the floor and appears to be ill at ease, hemmed in by ceramic vessels in the foreground. Most unsettling of all is the sinister-looking bird on her left. Although period commentators mistakenly identified the bird as the sacred Egyptian ibis, it is in fact a Marabou stork, a scavenging bird of prey, which appears in a number of other Orientalist works from this period, including Jerome's Marabou in the Harem Bath and Fortuny's Snake Charmers, with which Polenov was likely to have been familiar and which is currently in the collection of the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. With its long phallic beak and drooping folds of fleshy pink skin, the bird seems to hint at sexual predation, an avatar for the absent male master. In contrast to French and English representations of Black women, where, as Charles notes, the subject's Black faces are often obscured by drapery, or their backs are turned to the viewer so that only their dark ornamented bodies activate the scenes, Repin's and Polenov's representations place a lot of visual emphasis on the model's face, and in the case of the Egyptian girl, attempt to elicit sympathy from the viewer for her plight, a response typically reserved for white female slaves in European depictions. There are several possible explanations for these manifest divergences from European precedents. As members of the educated Russian elite, who associated with the civic-minded Peredvizhniki group, Repin and Polenov were deeply committed to social causes and to addressing systemic injustices, as evidenced by a number of their paintings, most notably The Barge Holes on the Volga and The Right of the Master. The latter work in particular raises the ominous issue of sexual exploitation and coercion, albeit through a historicizing lens. Consequently, Repin and Polenov may have intentionally embraced the opportunity to represent marginalized Black female subjecthood as a commentary on the persisting inequalities and injustices faced by people of color in modern European societies. In Russian racial and imperial discourses of the time, and especially in Slavophile publications, there was a constant refrain contrasting Russia's purported enlightened and egalitarian humanism with the racist and oppressive structures of Western Europe and the United States, of course. Thus, in his discussion of Alexander Pushkin's African heritage, Alexei Khomyakov emphasized that Russians esteemed the poet who, quote, that was a descendant of an Ethiopian with pride and joy, whereas he would have been denied citizenship in the United States and would have had the right and would not have had the right to marry the daughter of a washerwoman in Germany or of a butcher in England, end of quotation. Expanding and applying this logic to Russian colonization, the historian Stepan Yashevsky claimed that in the case of Western European nations, quote, the colonized natives tended to die out because of their ill treatment by the colonizers as racially inferior. By contrast, in the Russian colonial setting, and I'm quoting him, Inarodцы tribes do not die out when they're confronted with Russians. They naturally transform into Russians, absorbing specific qualities of the European Christian civilization, end of quotation. Similarly, the military geographer and Orientalist Mikhail Vinnikov contrasted Russia's so-called benign, non-coercive colonizing methods with the terrible treatment by Britain and Spain of their colonial subjects, concluding that, quote, Spanish colonization, as well as the English, was accompanied by the bloody annihilation of entire races and the enslavement of many millions of people. There is nothing comparable to it in Russian colonization, end of quotation. Now, in the interest of time, I will not dwell on the obvious hypocrisy and spurious nature of such claims, but I do want to emphasize that following the abolition of serfdom in 1861, Russia's imperial expansion in the Caucasus and Central Asia was increasingly framed in public discourse as an abolitionist cause. As evidenced by Vasilii Vereshagin's disturbing 1872 painting of a naked little boy being examined by a potential buyer, slavery still persisted in the Caucasus and Central Asia, as well as in Russia's southern borderlands, well into the closing decades of the 19th century. Significantly, in the 1870s, such liberationist rhetoric was often deployed to drum up support for the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78, and in the wake of the Balkan uprisings, which Polenov witnessed firsthand and recorded in a series of studies and sketches, as you can see on the screen here. Pan-Slavic advocates, both within and outside of the Russian Empire, believed that after having abolished serfdom in the heartland and eliminated the slave trade in the Caucasus and Central Asia, Russia was uniquely positioned to liberate the oppressed all over the world. Thus, for instance, the historian Sergei Zhigarev maintained that it was Russia's immediate imperative to, quote, help her Eastern co-believers and kindred in their struggle against Islam toward national and religious self-preservation, to remove them from Turkish enslavement and to bring them into the family of cultured European peoples. And of course, the subtext of that is that it should, of course, zealously safeguard Christian women from Ottoman harems. However, perhaps more than any explicit or implicit emancipationist or egalitarian considerations, Repin and Polenov were enticed by the creative possibilities of exploring an entirely new artistic theme, together with purely technical challenges that it presented, such as rendering a dark-skinned model in a dimly lit room and capturing the way her black skin reflected the flickering light, or created striking coloristic contrasts with her surroundings. Having tried their hands at a range of different genres in Paris, such as history painting, plein air landscape, and contemporary urban scenes, the Russian artists evidently felt that the ethnic and racial other provided a means to both test and assert their own thematic range and artistic capabilities. Already as early as 1817, the French artist Henri Girodet questioned the discrepancy between hierarchical racial models and aesthetic value, arguing that if a erudite student of the arts of Greece remarks what bizarre forms the inhabitants of the tropical and glacial zones often attached to the idea of beauty, the varied and contradictory types forged by so many nations, will he be firm enough in his principles to always believe that true beauty is singular, fixed, and unalterable? And if he does not lose his taste for the charms of absolute beauty, how many objects would nonetheless strike him by their immense variety, their sudden novelty, and their piquant originality? End of quotation. Much like Girodet, Repin and Polenov, even before they moved to Paris, were already invested in diversifying the Russian representational canon by depicting all kinds of subjects, including beggars, vagabonds, hunchbacks, and cripples, alongside refined upper-class subjects. Black subjecthood furnished them with yet another underrepresented and novel aesthetic category to explore. I would like to end my presentation with an evocative review by Apollon Matyushinsky of Repin's Portrait of a Negro Woman and Polenov's Egyptian Girl, which were both displayed at the Imperial Academy of Arts exhibition in St. Petersburg in 1876. He writes that, quote, Polenov's negress is pictured sitting on the ground with her back against the wall of some Egyptian building. If I'm not mistaken, we have already been fortunate enough to acquaint ourselves with this very negress in the painting of Mr. Repin. A more interesting question, perhaps, is why these talented artists have chosen to depict a Black creature in their paintings. Which aesthetic thoughts led them to decide to paint an Ethiopian beauty? It is quite understandable that such a subject can have its place in a painting in order to furnish a superb contrast and augment that which is beautiful, or quite simply to provide a dark passage necessary for the overall effect of the painting. But to base the entire content of a work of art on that which is hideous is really rather singular. End of quotation. This review makes clear that Matushansky both understood and subscribed to the conventions of European racial representations and implicit hierarchies, and was thus genuinely puzzled by Repin's and Polenov's unorthodox treatment of their Black sitters. Tellingly, Repin returned again to the subject of a Black woman in 1907, producing yet another compelling portrait, while Polenov went on to make a name for himself as a leading Russian Orientalist, scandalizing Russian audiences with his representations of a, quote, swarthy and deeply sunburned Semitic Christ. That's one of the period reviews. And of course, in the process, dismantling, if not the standards of beauty, at the very least, the entrenched practices of European racial representations. Thank you.
Okay, so I guess it's my turn now. I want to thank the organizers of this forum for inviting me. I'm really honored to be able to comment on such a wonderful work. I find this extremely rich and suggestive, really a model for deep reading of visual sources, beautifully contextualized. And I find the work particularly gratifying in the way that it resonates with so much of the recent scholarship on Orientalism and things that scholars have been seeing in other fields of scholarship, science, literature, etc. So I think this fits in very well. My observations perhaps will really underline a lot of the points that Maria has already brought out and may lead to some questions. But just on the broad level, clearly no one could say that these artists were unaware or oblivious to the European school of Orientalism. Quite to the contrary, Repin and Polenov clearly immersed themselves in it. And I think this is really valuable in the just showing these connections, showing how deeply they went in engaging with this body of work. I mean, clearly they admired these artists greatly and provided works that openly echoed the themes and motifs and style of Orientalist paintings. So clearly the connection is there. But yet, we see that when these Russian artists tried their hand at the Orientalist genre, it somehow came out very differently. And what's most striking to me is their ability to really see the person, see the human, to convey psychological depth, to give a sense of the inner self. This is particularly striking in Repin's portrait of the Black woman, for all of the reasons that Maria talked about. Polenov's portrait also, I think, is really striking for the way that it shows empathy. It shows not just a person, but a person who's thinking, a person who's suffering, a person who's troubled. And I find this really a striking contrast to the kind of flat, dehumanized, and eroticized paintings of artists like Gérôme and Fortuny. Clearly, there's something very different here. And I think also we could extend this to much of Vereshchagin's work as well, although he's not part of this, but I think I find him fitting very well into this conversation. Maria's offered some suggestions as to why this might be the case, and I'd be interested to hear more. Just a few quick points come to mind, partly underlying things that were in the presentations and maybe extending them a little bit. Points where I see this difference expressed. One question is, how much does the ethos of Russian populism and the ethos of the Peredvizhniki inform these works. I'm struck by the whole quest to depict the narod, to give a face to the downtrodden, to give personality. A lot of the classic portraits of peasants in the Peredvizhniki come to mind, and the whole ethos of not just showing someone who is oppressed, but showing their inner life. And this shows up in Repin's barge haulers, where it's really striking how each barge hauler is an individual with a person, with an inner life, and with a particular response to their predicament. And so I'm wondering if that kind of habit is informing these Orientalists' work and kind of sending these artists in a different direction. Another thing that I find really striking is the view of gender here. So much of the Orientalist oeuvre is aimed at portraying the Orient as a kind of erotic playground for the European imagination. And Repin and Polenov clearly know about this. They admire these works, but neither of them really embrace it. I mean, despite a few little hints, that first figure in Sadko, etc. And Vereshchagin fits into this too. I mean, he's kind of more extreme in this regard. If I'm not mistaken, there's really only one portrait he has of a woman, and that is a fully veiled woman whose face is not visible at all. So they're clearly not going here. I'm also struck by Polenov's Odalisque, which is just so different from the classic genre of the Odalisque. She's fully clothed. She's upright. Her eyes seem to be sort of rimmed with red, almost suggesting tears. So rather than an image of luxurious indolence, what we see is sorrow, suffering, perhaps resignation, again, the inner life. So it's really striking, why these Russian artists are so reluctant to delve into what would have been a commonplace in France. I mean, was it just prudishness, or was there some other thing at large at work here? And finally, I'm struck by the point that Maria brought out about the absence of a clear racialized hierarchy. Both Repin and Polenov's portraits of the Black woman are portraits alone, not in any kind of relationship that would show inferiority or subservience. And even Repin's Sadko, as Maria brought out, is really a parade of ethnicities without any clear markings of hierarchy. What's important is the distinctiveness of each figure. I'm almost reminded of Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker, the scene where all of the representatives of all of the different peoples come forth, each with their own particular dance, each with their own particular style of music. Again, what's important is the distinctiveness. And I wonder if what we're seeing here is perhaps different sort of models, almost like cosmologies of the human, rather than a vision seeing the world envisioned almost like a pedestal with successive hierarchical tiers leading to a supreme race. What we're seeing is the world, is humanity as an array of collective personalities, each one distinct, but not necessarily in a superior or inferior position. Again, what's important is the distinctiveness, expressed in part by physical experience, expression, or physical appearance, but not only that, but also by the products of human creativity as well. So it's kind of Herderian vision of humanity. I mean, is this a kind of helpful way of looking at this difference? Of course, we don't want to get too carried away with this, because here we have Matushinsky's unabashedly racist assessment to bring us back down to earth. And I think that's very useful to have that here. And whatever we may say about Russian views of the other, Russian views of the racial, I think the one thing we can agree on is that they are not homogeneous. They are diverse. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for, Maria, thank you for an absolutely fascinating talk. Nathaniel, you were the perfect person to address it. Thank you for your comments. And I think Sasha is now opening up the chat for questions, and you can either type your question into the chat, or you can just say that you have a question, and then Sasha will call on you, and you can go ahead and ask. Although first I should probably say, Maria, you may want to respond to some of Nathaniel's points.
Sure. Yeah, I think for me, the tricky aspect of navigating this material is that we don't have much in terms of sort of direct commentary of statements on these works from the artists themselves. I mean, they're sort of mentioned in correspondence in passing. Oh, I did this great portrait of this woman, but it's very hard. There's no expression of intention, and so it's really just sort of the unpacking of the work. And so, for me, I think I'm hesitant to ascribe, too much sort of critique. I don't know how much of it is them really commenting on, sort of racial relations in Paris or in London. But what struck me is the works themselves. And the way that they push against these conventions. And I think one of the things that Nathaniel brought up several times is Vereshchagin. And I actually don't include him because he doesn't have any paintings of people of Black or African descent, which is really interesting. There is mention of that in his correspondence that he made, interestingly enough, a painting of a Black subject in the US. But I have not been able to track this work down. I'd love to see what that looks like. Of course, Vereshchagin also was one of Jerome's, the Russian Jerome, so to speak, right? One of his star pupils. So I find that really interesting that, Repin and Polenov do these paintings because they're so unusual, both in the Russian and the kind of European canon, but also in relationship to arguably the most celebrated Russian Orientalist, Vereshchagin, who doesn't address the subject matter at all. So for me, that was kind of, because I feel like, probably people are wondering, well, why wasn't Vereshchagin part of this, right? And that's sort of why. So I don't know if that's really responding, but I just felt like because Vereshchagin came up several times, I wanted to kind of explain why he wasn't kind of a centerpiece of this talk. And I think they are questions.
Yes. So we have a question from Emily Wang. I wanted to ask how Chernava in the Sadko might have been perceived ethnically. To me, a 21st century American, she doesn't seem necessarily 100% non-white, but I'm not sure how she would have been read by contemporaries, especially given her coloring.
That's a really great question, and it's something that struck me too, that her features, I mean, she's got dark hair, she's got dark eyebrows, and she looks like some of Repin's paintings of Ukrainian models. He has a few like that, and they have similarly sort of dark features. I think based on the sort of the folktale, she is supposed to be Russian, whatever that means, right? But I think that's absolutely, a great observation that, she's not like blonde or blue-eyed, she's not. And that's what I feel like that kind of the absence of those racial hierarchies is so striking, because if that's really where Repin wanted to go with this, he could have, placed her more prominently in the painting. He could have made her look, much lighter. So I do think there's something there, but it's hard to make out her features. She's quite, she's sort of in the shadows. And so I didn't want to find myself in kind of, comparing skin tones. I know I didn't quite want to go there, but I think that's like a really good point, that even in this, I mean, you can kind of emphasize that more, that he's really not, this doesn't seem to be like his primary concern.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to add that, for me personally, and this might just be sort of interpretations that I've been thinking about that I haven't really developed, but her portrayal reminds me a little bit of Lisa from Pushkin's Barishnya Krestyanka, who sort of engages in various kinds of ethnic self-presentation, right? She's a smugle Krestyanka, and then she sort of like paints her face white to pretend to be European, authentic self is sort of a dark-skinned Russian, but also, you know, Europeanized in some way, which I personally interpret as, in some ways, potentially autobiographical on Pushkin's part, right? That he's sort of playing with his own sort of like the various positions he could have held in Russian society. But I haven't fully examined that. So thank you. This was a wonderful talk, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for that comment. Actually, I think that's something I really want to follow up on.
Valeria Sobel, if you'd like to ask your question, you can go ahead.
I could, but there was also another Sadko comment after me. If Olga wants to pick up, or Maria, because mine is not about the Sadko painting. Doesn't matter.
Sure, I can read out Olga's question. In Sadko, maybe it would be also good to consider the Russian context. Perhaps not the beauty of the white body, but the poetry and the Russian soul of the Russian woman is contrasted with the open sexuality of the foreign women. They are yet more specialized by the fact that they were originally European and then replaced by the more exotic and thus more sexual counterparts. It seems that this interest in the innocence is also presented in Polenov's Right of the Master, in a different context, of course. Thanks for the great paper, by the way.
Thank you. I think that's a really helpful comment. I'm not sure that there's really a question there.
Yes, I'm really sorry. There isn't really a question. I was just wondering, and thank you for reading my comment. I was just wondering that maybe it's also productive to read it in the way of what Russians are doing versus the Europeans in the way they're representing, right? For Repin, I think that idea, as Emily also pointed out, yeah, the idea of the Russian peasant is not necessarily white-skinned, because of course, if you're working in the field, you are going to have a suntan, and that's not okay, right? Mm-hmm. But that idea of innocence, that idea of piety, is very, very prominent on this picture, and that could be maybe helpful to kind of show the Russian difference.
Thank you. That's really helpful, and I think yes, it's all about the internal right qualities versus the external. I think that's definitely part of it, and I sort of want to go back for a second to what Nathaniel brought up about this idea of prudishness. You know, is there what's striking about both Polenov's and Odelysk and then Repin's portrait of the Black woman is that they're both clothed, and that's not how you depict odalisques normally, right? If you sort of looking back to the Fortuny image, they're always, you know, it's this perfect excuse to do the wonderful academic female nude. So that's also interesting. And, you know, one sort of comment is to say, well, it's just because, you know, nudes were not quite, I mean, and Margaret will speak much more to this than me, but, you know, that's not something that's very typical, right, especially in the Russian context at this moment. So that's sort of a larger question too. And the fact that Repin did include some nudity in Sadko, that was actually, the critics really sort of responded to that, and that was his French, that's his Frenchness, right? The fact that that gives us this nude. So I do think you're absolutely right in that there's some sort of moralizing also happening in this picture. That obviously the homely Russian girl would not, you know, is not depicted in the nude.
Christy Monet, you also had a question about Sadko, if you wanted to unmute yourself.
Hi, yes, and thank you, Maria and Nathaniel, for the presentation and the comments. So much to think about. I really wanted to sort of kind of follow up with Emily's question. I was also struck by, well, the interesting thing of Repin having seen sort of Black figures in art, and then going back to rework his Sadko. And at least for me, there is no sort of explicitly or obvious sort of dark-skinned model there. And I mean, whether or not, I guess, it's sort of comfortable or questionable or not to talk about different kinds of skin tones, I think that is the case. There are no dark skin models there. And that does seem to be a choice. And it made me think about the last slide you showed with the art critic who said something really interesting to me. He said, you know, in the one breath, he used the term sort of Ethiopian beauty. And in the last line, he says, you know, something hideous, right? So I'm just wondering if the juxtaposition of the sort of single subject, Black figure, Black woman, as opposed to the sort of Black woman in context, or the Black figure in context, if that former group being missing from this oeuvre, is that sort of a signal of Russia or Russian artists really lacking, maybe due to the lack of sort of Black Russian colonial subjects, or very many of them, is that sort of indicative of them lacking a sort of firm hierarchy there, that there's, we can talk about sort of the Black figure as a single curiosity, but we don't know where to place them, you know, in a stream of images. So that was just something I was thinking of. And yeah, I guess the question being sort of, might there be something to just the sort of imperial unfamiliarity with that subject that makes them hard to put into a context outside of just, you know, a single figure to themselves. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really great comment. So there's the figure with the feathered headdress. And I'm afraid I don't have a really good high resolution slide. It's a little bit discolored, and I apologize for that. So that figure has darker skin than the other female figures in the image, and her features do look a little bit like, I've been kind of staring at this painting, you know, in the Russian museum as close as I could get to it before the security sort of chases you away, and her features look very similar to the portrait of the Black woman. So I'm not sure if there's a link there where Repin used her features and kind of slightly altered them. So it's hard to say. I mean, again, I'm in this really uncomfortable business of trying to, you know, differentiate skin tones and sort of map ethnicities onto them. But there is this one figure. And so I don't know. Again, I mean, arguably, he could have made it much more explicit, right? He could have made her skin much darker, and he chooses not to do that. So I think, you know, it's hard to say. One thing that really, I think is important to take into consideration is also the idea of, and there's this wonderful volume that was published recently about Pushkin and his Blackness and how that signifies in Russian culture. So part of it is that I'm wondering if the relationship is also different, right? Of having these figures like Pushkin, like Hannibal, who are, you know, are prominent cultural and sort of, you know, aristocratic figures. And so the signification is different there. I also find in Matushinsky's comment, it's really interesting that he specifically says Ethiopian beauty, right? Because of course, sort of there are racial implications to that, but also Ethiopia being the kind of, you know, the Christian nation, and thinking forward to Gumilev, right? Ethiopia having this particular sort of space in the Russian imaginary as well. Because he could have said, you know, the Black woman, the African woman, but Ethiopian beauty, I think sort of identifying the model in that way is also significant. So I'm wondering, and I haven't really, I need to think more about this, right? And how those different categories signify and how they might, you know, relate to the possible meanings of these two works. And I don't know if that exactly addresses your question, but I think there's definitely something going on with that, right? This kind of different relationship with Africa that sort of Russian artists and cultural practitioners might have.
Yeah, thank you. Just to briefly respond. Yeah, the Ethiopia part is really interesting to me as well, because I know sometimes it's said that, you know, Pushkin had an Ethiopian like great grandfather, but in fact, like we know today that it's probably from present day Cameroon. So like just Ethiopia thrown out as a sort of Christian kingdom is definitely maybe definitely part of that valence. But thank you so much. Yeah.
Valeria, if you'd like to ask your question now, please go ahead.
Okay, no problem, because actually Christy asked one of my questions about that comment by the critic, right, that it indeed uses Ethiopia. Well, first of all, sorry, let me start again. Maria, thanks so much for the fascinating talk. I'll be in touch by email because it resonates with my kind of new project on radicals and race in like post-reform Russia. And it's kind of the same period, and I'm interested in this emancipatory context for that. So yeah, so I had that question, but I saw it like how you have this Ethiopian Beauty and they just reference to hideousness in the same, talking about the same painting. It's the first most obvious explanation is there is a kind of universal concept of beauty, right? That this particular type of beauty doesn't fit. So it can be beauty for the Ethiopian context, right? But it's still hideousness from that supposedly universal, right, Western perspective, which actually reminds me of, I think, Chadaev's, right, talking about how we mentioned the Ethiopians in the first philosophical letter that, okay, we're Christians, but we're the wrong kind of Christians, the Russians, right? We're not Catholic, Western Catholics. Ethiopians are Christians too, but doesn't make them part of this, right, universal, in his view, right, / Western European civilization. So there's something going on there between, I think, in terms of universality as understood by Western oriented critics. And so it's kind of a rambling comment, but really fascinating how it can be in the same paragraph. And my first, another question was about, I think early on you talked about, was it Repin using the same model for a Persian and Indian girl, or Polenov, one of them, or?
It's hard to tell because I'm just looking at the model itself, and it looks like it's the same model, but he talks about them in different terms. Like one is Indian, one is Persian. So I can't tell if it's the same model, but just like from different angles.
She looked pretty much the same, which is interesting right?
It looks like the same model to me. So I'm not sure.
Yeah. Okay, because it's interesting because it doesn't matter really, right? As long as she's Oriental, how much distinctiveness are we talking about here, right? There is still this kind of very vague idea. So yeah, but I kind of at first also had doubts about this dark figure in Sadko, because when you compare the very explicit Negro woman in the Western painting and then the more kind of, individual spiritual one in Russian, I had my kind of skeptical reaction, but I think Nikita just posted a link to the better resolution, and I think there's definitely, something going on there in the lines of your argument. So yeah, thanks so much. I had like a couple of small reactions, but I'm very interested in your project and we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much for those comments. So yeah, please do be in touch.
I have a question from Sergei Bogatyrev. It would be interesting to know more about Repin and Polenov's attitude to Orientalism in general. Could it be that depicting Black subjects was part of becoming Western and European because Western artists depicted such subjects?
Yeah, that is really the million-dollar question, right? Where is that really what's going on, in that they, not only does that make them Western European, but it also makes them cosmopolitan and modern, right? Because the kind of the cutting edge artists like Manet, that's what they're doing, right? So that's really what I'm trying to unpack, and I have to be 100% honest with you. I'm not entirely decided on, that's really what's going on. I mean, one other possibility, it's just the novelty of being able to commission these models. I mean, this is just something that they wouldn't have been able to do in Russia, right? They admire Orientalist artists, obviously. I mean, they write these effusive comments about Fortuny, about Regnault. I mean, they're poring over Regnault's correspondence and their travel accounts. But they don't specifically comment on the genre itself. I would sort of say that, to me, it feels very much like here they are in Paris. They're here to learn something, right? And so they need to do what, their French contemporaries are doing. It seems that this is like the thing that everybody's doing. So what we're going to do that too. But then what they give us is so non-Salon, non-Orientalist, right? So then the question is, well, why? Because they don't get it? Or, I mean, they've clearly seen enough of these works, so they know how the genre works, surely. So, if it's a conscious sort of reframing of the genre, then with what purposes and to what ends, and what is the final result? Or is it like a genuine misunderstanding? And here I have to say, I just think they know better. I feel like they're not just these like innocent country bumpkins who just like, oh, I'm just going to do this and I get it all wrong. I mean, that's always a possibility, but I feel that there is intentionality to the specific choices that they're making. And so for me, it's like, why, right? What is the sort of the end goal of this? And that's really what I'm trying to unpack. But again, because they don't say much about these works themselves, it's really kind of trying to unpack this through kind of references to the visual. Rather than, I mean, I would have loved to have like a letter where they say exactly, I painted this because I wanted to like really make a splash, at the St. Petersburg, exhibition or something. But I just don't have that textual, documentary evidence to support that. So I have to kind of go a little bit out on a limb.
All right, and we have a question from Bart Paschow. Perhaps I missed it, but I was wondering if you made anything of the golden chain in Polenov's Egyptian Girl. I'm thinking about how tropes of aestheticized chains are represented in terms of larger visual culture of slavery in the 19th century.
So that's actually really interesting. I'm guessing that the reference is she's holding like this cord. It's not clear that it's a chain. And actually, I presented this work in a different forum, and we kind of were poring over this cord that she's holding, and ultimately, it's not clear that it's a chain or something else. So her identity then is really kind of unmoored, because it's not clear that she's necessarily a slave. She doesn't display any, typical visual tropes. She doesn't have shackles or, so, but based on her sort of facial expression and her body language, she doesn't seem like she's happy to be where she is, right? So that implies something about her being in some kind of oppressive situation or sort of conditions of unfreedom. But again, it's not, and that's the other thing. Like if Polenov wanted to do a really obvious chain, he could have easily done that. So it's not clear what that kind of cord is supposed to be. So again, I'm sorry, that's not a terribly satisfying answer, but I think a lot of what I find so sort of fascinating and rich about these works is just how ambiguous they are. And how they I think are purposely open-ended, and even a lot of the kind of the material artifacts that they're depicting. So yeah, I wish I could say more about that, but I'm not even sure that that's a chain.
Sure, I'll just respond really quickly. Thank you so much for engaging these topics. I'm really excited about this. The reason I was asking was because I was thinking a lot about what Charmaine Nelson has written about in her work on neoclassical sculpture and images of like the sculpted Black body or lack thereof in the 19th century, and especially about like Hiram Powers, the Greek slave, and how the many different manifestations you start changing how the chains are from being like very like dainty and delicate into like slave manacles, and how that's kind of a way to kind of that this change is in dialogue with ideas about abolition. I guess yeah, I definitely really agree about, I think leaning into the ambiguity is really important, I think, and not being definitive, because I think I've written a lot on 19th century Baltic provinces in Estonia and Latvia, and I think that sometimes it's very easy to lean into the psychological, like we want to give more agency and more depth, especially to Black subjects in the 19th century and during, while slavery exists in many parts of the world still, and especially in the Americas. So I just wanted to say I really appreciate, I think the ambiguity is not always, I mean, it's frustrating as researchers, but I think it can be really kind of productive sometimes. So thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
And we had a question from Anne. I guess just a thought, I'll read the comment now that I mentioned it. Thinking about types versus particularities, the marked singularity of the dark-skinned faces in the Russian paintings we saw versus more of type look in the Western ones. Not sure this would hold true generally though, just a thought. The tension between generality and specificity in ideas of beauty is always fascinating.
Yeah, I don't know if I made that clear. It was really just a reflection on kind of the ideological significance of particularity versus type. And, you know, the very beautiful particularity of the Black woman in the two paintings that we looked at for a long time seemed very ideologically charged in that sense, in the same way that that types are ideologically charged because they involve so much elision.
Yeah, no, that's actually a really wonderful point, and I think the other issue that I didn't really delve into, but that is also, you know, I think somehow lurking in the background, or is this idea of sort of genre, right? I mean, they're both realists, and they're grappling with this very salon academic style, right? So is part of those differences also kind of the realist commitment, right, to the individual, and that kind of runs up against the fiction of the salon painting, right? And this is why Repin really hates Sadko. I mean, he writes all these letters where he's like, it's a failure. It's the worst painting. If it wasn't, you know, a commission by society, I would destroy it. It's horrible. And I think part of it is precisely because he struggles, right, to do this salon style painting. It's sort of, that's not his thing. And for example, a lot of period reviewers and even Staffaso is like, you know, he goes to the aquarium and he tries to do all these sea creatures, and like it doesn't work because it's a fairy tale, and it's just like, and that's the part where the whole thing falls apart. So I'm wondering if there's also something with that, and that can also partially explain how different those two works are in comparison to what we see from, you know, French and British artists.
So you're saying that you think there could be something about the Sadko, sort of what he was commissioned to do, that makes him feel like he's being pushed toward types, and that's not the direction he would ideally go? Is that?
I don't know. It's a thought. I feel like it's, yeah. I mean, I feel like I would need more sort of proof, but that's one thing I'm thinking as well. Is it also because it's a commission, he has to do it. That's also, he needs the money. So it's, you know, but it's a painting that he hated, and it's so ironic because it was highly acclaimed when it came back to Russia.
Just sorry, one more thought, and this is in relationship to what Bart Pouchot was saying. That horrible, to my mind, sculpture by Hiram Powers of the slave, what do they call it, chained slave or something like that, which I've always hated, and I realized I hate it because everything specific has been elided, right? Every single thing, everything is smoothed out, everything is sort of like tamed, and it's so different from what we're seeing in the paintings you were talking about. So thank you.
A question from Georgi Papashvili. By Ethiopians as Christians, do you think it could be part of Russia's ambitions as the third Rome or second Constantinople? Too much blame, in my opinion.
That's a good question. And you know, I don't know how much of it is, you know, Polenov's or Repin's intention, and how much of it is, you know, how these works are received. Is it part? Are they playing into some sort of larger discourse about sort of Russia's imperial ambitions? I think that's a great question. I'm not sure, to be honest. I don't know if we're supposed to identify with these figures as, you know, fellow Christians. I do think the reference to the Ethiopian, you know, beauty is not accidental, but of course that's the critics' interpretation, right? Neither Repin or Polenov say anything about this model being anything at all Ethiopian, or, you know, so so it is curious what, you know, how it would have resonated, whether this would have been some kind of like call to arms, you know. I do think it's interesting that this sort of Russian exceptionalism comes up again, right? The idea that, oh, you know, these terrible British and French oppressors, and of course Russia is different, and therefore, you know, that the sort of the Ethiopian beauty is sort of a kindred spirit or something like that. I mean, I'm not sure I'd want to extrapolate it in that way, but it is possible. Of course, there's also kind of, I guess, a Byzantine connection. That rhetoric was obviously really intense in the 1870s in relation to the Balkans, and the idea of, you know, Moscow, the Third Rome, and New Constantinople. I don't know if those two works would register in that way. I mean, one of the things that I find interesting about Polenov's work is that he sets a Black figure in an ancient Egyptian context, which is very unusual, because when we look at British or French depictions of ancient Egypt, I mean, they're definitely, they're not Black figures, and so that's also sort of interesting that he chooses to set this model. I mean, Repin sets her in a loosely kind of, you know, vague Orient, whereas, you know, Polenov makes a point of setting her. So is she supposed to be a Nubian? Is she supposed to be Ethiopian? You know, I mean, that would obviously be anachronistic, but it's also interesting. One of the things I was really struggling is that choice. And why he decides to do that, right? Because to me it implies some kind of commentary on slavery and her being, you know, oppressed. Of course, we know that the Egyptians did have, you know, Nubian slaves who were in the kind of also subjected to a racial hierarchy and were kind of on the bottom, you know, ranks of their own hierarchy. So so I don't know. It's a good question. I'm sorry, I feel like I didn't really address it, but I generally don't know if that's, you know, if that was how it was read.
Georgi, I think you noted that you wanted to follow up. If you'd like to follow up, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your presentation, first of all, and just quick information. For example, I'm sure many of you knows Georgian artist Gabashvili, or he was more known as Gabayev, Russified. He has painted also Black people. Of course, at times they were called Negroes. It was quite common. And at the same time, he painted Samarkandians, Jews. And I think it's well into the trend of this all. And I would call it rather exoticism than narrowly Orientalism, because it's many directions, not only the Orient. Thank you.
Yeah,
And
no,
sorry, the year is 1890 when he paints his Negroes.
thank you. That's really fascinating, actually, and I will definitely follow up on that. I think you're right that it doesn't necessarily have to be. I mean, I think in Repin's case, because there's the hookah and, you know, the kind of Eastern accoutrements, right? I feel like that sort of fits into the Orientalist genre, but of course, the Egyptian girl doesn't necessarily need to be. I mean, I do think you're right in that it's just kind of general exotica. So no, that's a great comment. Thank you.
Anastasia Loisova, if you'd like to ask your question, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much. Maria, thank you. I have a little comment. I think that there is a big difference between Polenov and Repin, and the attention to Orientalism, because in France it was only a first glance on this Orientalism, and it was Orientalism in Paris. And of course, it's exotic and I think allegoric exotic for Repin. But Polenov, in some years, he was twice there, in Orient. And for him, of course, it's a real Orient. This is a very big difference from Sadko, and Polenov glances to the Orient French experience and his real experience in Egypt and then in Syria, in Bible places. I want to say that there he studied Negro men and Negro women very rare. And there were a lot of Egyptian people, and he's interested both in their ethnic details and especially in the characters, I think. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that's what I find so interesting about Polenov, is that he sort of, he tries this when he's in Paris. And then when he goes, I think that his first trip is in '82, he, this becomes his whole genre, right? I think after Vereshchagin, he's the next sort of Orientalist, if you will, a biblical Orientalist. But I think it's also, what's interesting is the differences, the really stark differences between the Egyptian girl and the portrait of Repin's portrait, right? They're so different. The fact that Polenov sort of ventures into sort of nudity, Repin doesn't. I think those two works also, there's so much difference between them, and surely they're painted in the same time, they're using the same model. What also accounts for those really different final looks of those two paintings. And I think the other thing is, of course, Repin does this and then he goes back and he maybe flirts a little bit with the genre again in some of his other works, but that's sort of it. Whereas, Polenov is really taken in by this. Now, he takes it in a different direction in the 80s and the 90s, but I'm sort of, I'm also trying to think through what is the link, right? That's sort of part of the next phase of the project, is what is the link between his time in Paris and then what he goes on to do later on. And of course, what I find really fascinating about Polenov is, his commitment to painting this historic Christ, right? And of course, there's so much backlash, right? This goes so much against the kind of orthodox canonical, depiction of Christ, that's also, that's an interesting choice that he makes. So yeah, I think,
Yeah, I think it's just a Russian choice. It's in a Russian tradition, in the Russian 19th century tradition. So thanks a lot, and I want to be in touch with you also, because my real now project is about the Orientalism and Polenov and his travels. Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. Please do. I'd love to be able to talk more about this.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
I see several comments. Are there any more questions?
I have a comment, but I don't have a question, and it's kind of a closing comment, so I'll hold off.
I have a comment, but it also may be a question. So I posted on the chat the image of Karl Gunn Odalisque. I wonder whether you also consider this painting, because it's the same period, and it is a conventional Orientalist painting. I think it's now in the private collection in the United States. It was a relatively recent auction sale. So, and it's a kind of third perspective from Russian, well, if we consider Gun Russian artists, but at least in the territories of the Russian Empire, three different takes on the same subject. So my quick question is whether you know about this painting, and whether they painted the same model.
Thank you so much. I actually didn't know about this painting, so thank you so much for bringing this to my attention. I mean, I should say that, you know, the time that they're in Paris in the 70s, Konstantin Makovsky is also there. And of course, he also travels to North Africa in the 70s, and he produces a whole array of, you know, images of odalisques and sort of black figures, both male and female. So, and he's there, you know, he's there at the same time. And I have, you know, yet to really flesh out those connections, but it seems like that's potentially also who they might be in dialogue with. Now, arguably, Makovsky's is more of a kind of a more academic, sort of more polished style. So for me, it was, again, interesting in how, you know, they are committed realists. So, you know, what's happening with that. And I mean, you could argue that, well, it's early days, they're just, you know, they're pensioners of the academy. But of course, this is after the barge holders, right? So for me, it's like, you know, Repin's already made his kind of splash as this sort of realist artist depicting the oppressed. And then, you know, why does he then go back to some of the salon style painting? And I think part of it is that he doesn't, right? He takes it and then he produces something new with it. But that's really interesting. I mean, the other painting that I was also thinking is that's a little later, it's from the 90s, but the figure of a newly bought for the harem, where you have a prominent sort of black man and a light-skinned woman sort of crying on the floor, and we're to understand that she has just been, you know, purchased for the harem. And but that is also by, you know, by an academic artist. So, you know, part of it is also me trying to figure out that what was it, the sort of interface between the realist and the academic. Mm-hmm. But thank you so much for bringing that painting to my attention. That's fascinating. I am going to pore over this.
Yeah, and just a brief follow-up is that this Gun's painting, it was actually, I think, at one of the Peredvizhniki exhibitions, and it's listed, but there's nothing written by the critics on this painting, so which might indicate that it was actually taken out of the exhibition or something. So it could be a context for why particularly Repin chosen, and Polenov chosen not so much sexualized image. So having in consideration the practices of exhibitions in Russia, right, and the exhibitionist circle, when they often took place during the Lent, which there was this particular religious sentiment, which interestingly played with such kind of subject matters. But thank you so much. Very, very interesting.
Thank you.
I think if there are no more questions, we can wrap up.
Just some very, very quick, small comments that came to mind during the discussion, if I can. Just getting back to Sadko and the question of the Slavic figure in there, and strikes me what makes her immediately recognizable as being Slavic is not the facial feature, which you can't really see, but it's her costume. And I think the importance of fabric design as a marker of ethnicity, I think is prominent throughout, and it's just important to keep in mind that ethnicity, even racial features, are not limited to the skin and the physical features, but also you know, clothing, decoration, embroidery, these sorts of things are important as well. And you know, I wonder. was sort of struck by the notion of like a kind of habitus of seeing in these artists that might color the way they view these sorts of things, and thinking again about their commitment to realism and this sort of way of looking at the self, looking at the person, and perceiving that, and that's not something that you can lose that easily. I think my sense is that that's kind of the way Repin was formed as an artist, to see in that particular way. And so in that sense, maybe it kind of makes sense that even coming to this Orientalist subject matter, he still has that frame of mind, that kind of habitus, and that he's not losing. And that may be some way of explaining this particularity that we see. So, yeah, some thoughts.
Yeah, I think absolutely right. Are they the sort of realist artists who can't step outside of that, right? And, at different points of their stay in Paris, I mean, they're not particularly happy, right? They're like, well, we don't know what we're doing here. And certainly Kramskoy and, Stasov are sort of saying, oh, Repin really needs to come back because he's starting to lose his way, right? So I think there is this sort of certainly anxiety of, okay, if you are going to do a kind of a Western European thing, how do you still maintain your sort of your own essence, or your kind of your special authorial touch, right? You don't want to do a painting, and maybe that's part of the reason that Repin struggled with Sadko so much, is that it goes too much away from sort of what he's used to and what he thinks is his what he's supposed to do. So I think there's also that. It's like, how do you maintain your own sort of specificity and not just get absorbed into the salon culture and become unmarked, so to speak.
Yeah, and just one other thought. I was struck by the phrase biblical Orientalism, which is actually interesting because there's some very good scholarship, particularly on German Orientalism, academic Orientalism, and philology, and the links between biblical studies and Orientalism are very, very strong. And it puts Orientalism in a whole different framework, because through biblical Orientalism, you're really looking for a connection to the self in the Orient, the roots to the self in the Orient, the roots to spirituality. And it does seem to be something that's very prominent in Russian art and controversial in Russian art. I'm thinking of Nikolai Gay's portrayals of Christ and so forth. And so, I mean, that's, maybe when you're done with this topic, you can move on, because it really is something that deserves to be explored much, much further. So, Ivanov's work, I mean, going way back too. I mean, that's, anyhow, interesting thoughts.
Yes, that's crucial, and I think part of what I'm trying to think through is also, where is the self in this, right? And of course, when Repin and Polenov are in Paris, the criticism they're getting is that you're becoming too French, you're losing your Russianness, right? So for me, a question, I think, and one of the interesting comments that came up with the Sadko, right, the Russian maiden who does not, who looks quite, dark, or for want of a better word. And what does that say about the self and one's own, ethnicity and roots? And especially because in Russia, it's so contested, right? I mean, how much of you is Western or Eastern, or, so I do feel that that's part of it. And certainly I think with Polenov, he was saying, I'm trying to figure out the real archaeological Christ, right? There's this kind of positivist, sort of scientific ethos that underpins it. But of course, everybody's so upset, and he gets into quite a bit of trouble. People are saying that he's, insulting religious sensibilities by depicting Christ in this non-canonical way. So I do think, there's a lot of this. I think that the self other thing is really interwoven into all of this as well. It's quite, intricately, and kind of a central part of how these works are perceived too.
Yeah, thanks.
Sarah Dickinson, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, okay. Maria, thank you very much for that fascinating talk. That was great. And I'm going to ask you a question explicitly that's kind of in the chat less explicitly, which is, what do you think about the possible influence of Bryullov on the way that these painters were imagining the Orient and or exotic women? I just put a link to the Bakhchisarsky Fontan painting of Bryullov. I'm not sure what year that's from, but the women's faces look a lot like the women in Sadko. I don't know if you have a comment on that. I mean, as a kind of Russian source for exoticism beyond the Parisian sources.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And I mean, obviously, Bryullov actually, traveled to Constantinople, and he produces this whole cycle of paintings. There's another study where he shows a sort of a harem scene where the sort of the black servant removes the clothes from the white, again, odalisque. So that's definitely, there's a whole, series of images on this. What I find interesting is that Bryullov doesn't include nudity in his work, unlike Sadko, and that could be part, could it be part because of the 1830s, 1840s context? He did do his Bathsheba in the nude, right, which also has this white, model with a black figure pairing, and Alison Lee has written really beautifully about how that painting is really, it completely breaks all the proper codes of Orientalism. It does all kinds of weird things, and Alison reads that as a mistranslation. Like the Bryullov just doesn't get it right. He doesn't get the genre right. But it's early days. It's the 1830s and 40s. So that's could be part of it. So I think that's a really good question. Neither Repin or Polenov referred to Bryullov in any way in any of their correspondence or their diaries. So I'm not sure how much of that is, an influence or a source. I mean, sure, they obviously know of its existence. So, is this them doing an updated, a late 19th century version of that? I mean, he's specifically, I think, referencing, Pushkin's work. So it's also, there's a kind of a literary translation there, which is not what they're doing. So I think, I don't have a direct reply, a direct answer, in the sense that I don't know how much of them there are in dialogue. I mean, Bryullov is not the only one. Ayvazovsky has his whole cycle of paintings from Constantinople from the same time period in the 1840s. Of course, Gagarin is the other one who has a whole cycle of, again, Caucasian works and Orient and harems and sort of Oriental beauties and things like that. They are all fully clothed. This is important. And again, it could be part of, when we look at odalisques too or harems in the British context, and I'm thinking specifically of someone like Frederick Lewis, they're all fully clothed, right? So that there's also something to do with, sort of Victorian modesty versus the French. Of course, the French are, tons of gratuitous nudity. That's what the French do, right? So there's also part of that. So I do think there's something very interesting in Polenov showing the Egyptian girl, topless. I think that's certainly provocative. But what's interesting also is that there was a lot of pushback against that in the contemporary reception. So there was a lot of comparison between the two, with critics saying Repin's Black Woman is really great. He's done a wonderful job. It's a masterful portrait, and Polenov's is a disaster. And I also wonder, how much of that has to do with him breaking some of these, codes of what's, appropriate, what's too racy. But then at the same time, you have nudity in Sadko and everybody loved it. So I'm not entirely, sure what triggers, right, certain responses in the reception of those works. But I do think, I think they are obviously aware of the Russian precedents, but I think they're, the Regnault and Fortuny are just much more immediate, partly because there was a huge Fortuny retrospective in Paris in 1875, which they went to, both of them. So I'm wondering if that sort of is more of a more immediate stimuli.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
I have a comment that might work as a closing comment if we don't have any more questions. No? Well, first of all, I just wanted to thank both Maria and Nathaniel. Maria, this is absolutely fascinating talk. Nathaniel, you were the perfect person to speak to it. And I think the conversation has been so enriching. And it really makes me think about how race is so differently constructed, obviously, in different times and places. And I say, obviously, but the fact is, we have to be reminded of it over and over. We have to be reminded of its constructedness and its difference. And it's so useful in that sense to look at the Russian case. All of these kind of overlapping things happening, you know, Russians going to Europe, Russians thinking about their own empire, Russians thinking about Jewish ethnic types as a way to find Russian narodnost. I mean, all of these things complicate our own ideas about race in such useful ways. And I'm very grateful to you for using this fascinating material to help us think through it. So thank you very much, everybody. This was fantastic.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you for everybody's comments, and thank you for all your wonderful suggestions. And it's been a real pleasure. And thank you for again being here at the start of a new academic year. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And thanks so much to Anne and Sarah and Margaret. Thank you.
Okay.
Just before I'm sorry, I was just going to say before we close, the first meeting of the early Turgenev 19B group is tomorrow. And I will send a link to the 19B homepage in the chat now for all those who are interested.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.